bill, he didn't like the first bill. The changes between the first bill and the second bill were largely John McCain stepping in and saying no to Senate Democrats, no to Senate Republicans, no to the White House, and saying, I'm going to side with House Republicans who do not want this big government solution. If anything, I wish he'd stayed engaged longer, but I think he was concerned that he would be forcing himself into that issue too deeply, given that the Democrats are attacking him. But the reality is, the bill improved in part because John McCain stepped in, and quite frankly, the first bill would have been dramatically worse if John McCain hadn't stood up in the cabinet room of the White House and said to everybody in the room, you're wrong, House Republicans have some points here.
You buying that?
I wasn't there in the negotiations between John McCain and others. I can't comment, Ted.
Okay, let's move. Go ahead, real quickly.
Well, we'll have time for
okay, all right. Congressman, the concept of privatization of Social Security, how do you feel about it?
Well, I think it's a mischaracterization of the term. Social Security is on shaky financial ground in the long term. We have to do something to resolve that. You either have to raise taxes, which I don't think is viable, or you have to cut benefits, which I will never vote for, or you have to figure out a way to strengthen it financially, and allowing younger Americans to invest and take advantage of what Einstein called the most powerful force in the world, compound interest, is the step that has to be taken to strengthen the funding behind Social Security. When it was created, there were something like 60 workers for every retiree. Now we're down to 2 or 3 workers for every retiree. A pay-as-you-go system could work if you had 30 or 40 or 50 workers for every retiree. It can't continue to work when you have 2 or 3 workers, or really we're getting down to where there are 2 workers per retiree.
Entitlement reform, something's got to be done, correct?
Well, I think you have to look in terms of privatization of Social Security, Ted, at what's happening now. One thing that's clear from this disaster we're seeing is that the policies of massive deregulation, of letting the markets run wild, of this belief, this crazy belief that Wall Street could regulate itself. And John's been one of the biggest cheerleaders for those policies. Those policies haven't worked. They failed us. And fortunately, back in 2005, when privatization of Social Security was on the table, we didn't go along with George Bush and with John and agree to that. Because if we'd done so, folks approaching retirement, folks in their late 50s, would find themselves, after making investments in stocks that were perceived to be ultra-safe, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, they'd find themselves without their retirement savings, a part of their retirement savings, and no safety net to lean back on.
Bob likes to talk about massive deregulation having caused this problem. In point of fact, it's not massive deregulation. There's been no deregulation of the financial sector that he's referring to. What has happened is that, and to the extent there was, it was opposition by Democrats in Congress, namely Barney Frank, to tightening the reins on Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. It was Democrats who resisted tightening the reins on Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. This crisis was largely caused by the federal government urging the lenders in this country to make shaky loans. There are a whole series of policies that began with the Community Reinvestment Act, and then policies that were carried out by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and policies that were carried out by the Federal Reserve at the urging of Congress, which caused too much money to go into the market at too low an interest rate, encouraging people to take out loans they couldn't afford.
Entitlement reform in general, from what you're hearing.
Well, it's not really true that deregulation didn't work, or deregulation didn't cause this. In December of 2000, the insurance requirements for credit default swaps were basically eliminated, so that financial institutions were buying these packaged and bundled mortgages, and they thought they were buying insurance, but insurance was not regulated, didn't have anybody backing it up, and that's one of the big problems that caused this. And deregulation works. It would have worked. Financial institutions, you're going bust, that's deregulation. That was the market disciplining these business people. But Congress said, no, we're not going to let deregulation work.
Ted, if I may,
please.
You know, it's not only deregulation, but it's a mindset of stubbornly refusing to consider regulation. When Wall Street was on a drinking binge, if you will, in 2003, 4, and 5, and there was no one there, no one in power in Congress or in the White House to say, hey, you're done drinking for the night. And here we're facing the hangover. And that's the problem. It's a mindset, it's a philosophy that the markets can absolutely govern themselves, that they need no oversight from government. We need to restore that oversight and make sure this doesn't happen again.
I want to move on, but this is so important right now. Did the pendulum swing too far toward deregulation as opposed to where it was, say, in the 70s?
I really don't think so, Ted. I think what you saw that really caused this was the Congress pushing money out into the market. The Community Reinvestment Act said every American should own a home. I'm for that. But when Clinton came in, he rewrote the regulations to say to banks, if you don't make shaky loans, basically if you don't make loans which are not the kind of loans you would normally justify, you will be punished. And the regulations actually said that. And so there was greed on Wall Street. I mean, if we're going to talk about punishing greed on Wall Street, I'm for punishing greed on Wall Street. But the government set the policy that said we want you to loan and we'll punish you if you don't loan. We want low interest rates. They rewrote the laws governing the Federal Reserve. They told Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, you need to push money out into the market. And then there were hearings, and John McCain stood up, and a guy named Richard Baker from Louisiana stood up and said, this Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are out of control. And Barney Frank said, no, 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 they're just fine. And they weren't just fine. Those two congressmen are Democrats.
I don't agree with that. During that time, I was working as an investment manager, and it was all throughout the literature, known by everyone, that there was a conscious policy by the Secretary of the Treasury working with the Federal Reserve to increase consumer demand by allowing easy money out there to purchase homes so that people's net worth would increase and they'd think they had more money and we'd keep this economy going. It was pretty short term, but that's what happened.
Okay, I want to move on to, and I know you have criticized the congressman regarding his allegiance to the Bush administration, and this was something that you saw as an attack on his positions. If an Obama administration comes in and you are representing the 3rd District, would you not try to help him get his policies through?
I'll help him get his policies through as long as they're in the interests of the 3rd District of Arizona. But Ted, there's areas where I disagree with my fellow Democrats. I'll give you an example. Capital gains and dividends taxes. The current rate is 15%. My fellow Democrats are looking to raise those. I absolutely think that would be the wrong thing to do. They've been internalized in the capital markets. If we were to raise those rates now, it would harm the capital markets at a time they're the most fragile. And there's other areas, gun ownership rights and agricultural subsidies, where I disagree with my fellow Democrats. And that's where John and I disagree. John has said that it's his duty to support Republican Party leadership. 98% of the time he's voted with that party leadership. The Arizona Republic characterized him as always intensely partisan. And this is how bad it got. With the 21st Century GI Bill was enacted earlier this year. The first time it came up, it is a bill that will give our troops returning from Iraq and Afghanistan, the soldiers and Marines who risked their lives for their country, the chance to get a first-class college education. First time it came up, George Bush said to vote no, and John did. The second time around, George Bush said to vote yes, and John voted yes. So I represent something different. I won't be blindly following my party's leadership.
Congressman.
Ted, you described it accurately. It is an attack, and it's an unfounded attack. Yesterday's Arizona Republic ran an editorial strongly endorsing me, calling me a standout in Congress. On this charge of voting with President Bush all the time, they said, few lawmakers of either party can claim to have opposed the domestic spending proposals of the Bush administration as ardently as John Shadegg. And then they went on, as for the defining crisis of the Bush era, the Iraq War, the only Republican to stand up to the administration as early and consistently as John Shadegg was John McCain. And that specific charge that I vote as a factotum of the Bush administration, this newspaper said does not square well with reality. And Bob Robb, the Republic's editorial columnist who does politics, called that charge by Mr. Lord fundamentally false. I crossed the Bush administration again and again. I voted against each of their 3 major legislative initiatives. You can't find a congressman that has stood up more to them. In my first term in Congress, I stood up to the Republican leadership so much that they had promised me a committee assignment, and then they took it back. And Tom DeLay looked me in the eye and said, Shadegg, you crossed us too many times, you don't get the committee assignment. This charge is just manufactured.
98%. Always intensely partisan. These are the Republic's words, always intensely partisan, and 98% is a lot. I mean, no party is right 98%.